I'm Kirk Harnack. On This Week in Radio Tech, it's episode number 119. We're talking with Paul Shulins about things like HD radio tech, personal people meters, complacency in the engineering office, and the IEEE. I'm joined by Tom Ray and Chris Tobin for This Week in Radio Tech, coming up next.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is This Week in Radio Tech, episode 119, recorded March 7th, 2012. Paul Shulins. This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by Axia Audio and the IQ Core console engine. Check it out on the web at axiaaudio.com/IQ. It's time for This Week in Radio Tech. Hello there, I'm Kirk Harnack, your host for the show. Awfully glad you're with us. If you've tuned into the show, you're going to hear about broadcast engineering, specifically radio engineering, audio, RF, managing these new complicated systems that have been coming into broadcasting for years now. And tonight on this show, on this episode, we've got a guy who is really a master at taking new technology and making it work for the talent at the radio station, for the programmers, and for the engineers, so that the stations, in this case, many stations, stay on the air, sound great, are legal, and all the things that engineers have to worry about. So let's go around real quick around the horn and introduce everybody on the show. First of all, I'm Kirk Harnack. I work for the folks at Telos, Omni, and Axia, which happens to also be the sponsor for the show, and I thank them very much for that. Also with us, the best-dressed engineer in radio from Manhattan, New York, it's Chris Tobin. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Kirk. And I'm Chris Tobin, and I'm with CCS Musicam USA, and here in New York City, and it was a very nice warm day. Actually, it was very nice weather.
Awesome. And Chris has a ton of experience, kind of like Paul Shulins, who's our guest, at taking new technologies and making them work for radio. So that's going to be an interesting topic. I know Tom and Paul will have a lot to discuss here. Also with us from the Hudson Valley of New York, it's Tom Ray, the man who adds a little humor to our show. Hey, Tom.
The man, the myth, the legend in his own mind, and who has a great face for radio. Hi, I'm VP Engineering at WOR Radio in New York, Buckley Broadcasting. And yes, Chris is right. It was a lovely day today, and it was a great drive home, having the sunroof open for a change.
Oh, my goodness, that had to feel good. Hey, how's that HD radio in your Ford?
The HD radio in my Ford is actually doing very well, and actually I will have an article coming out in Radio World. I've got to write it this weekend. Excuse me. They asked me to kind of reprise my article from 2 years ago when I put the radio into the Ford to see if I could actually get one this time around. So found some interesting things and found some disturbing things, and that's what we'll be discussing.
All right. Well, we're all wanting to know about the disturbing things.
Well, you come to the right guy for disturbing things. What can I tell you?
Yeah, because we just like salacious news like that. All right. And also with us, our guest from Boston, from Greater Media in Boston, the Director of Engineering there at Greater Media. I hope I got that right. Maybe the title's something else. I didn't ask him. It's Paul Shulins. Hi, Paul.
Hi, how you doing? I am just delighted to be here. I am the Director of Technical Operations for the Greater Media Boston, and it's BOSTON. But we have 5 FM stations in Boston, and I was part of one of the very first major market consolidations back in 1998, and we learned a lot there, and I'm happy to share some of the fun things that we've been doing. One of the reasons I got into radio was thank you for correcting that. It looks a lot better now on the title there. But one of the reasons I got in was the creative aspect of radio. It's different every day, and we're doing a lot of fun things that keep my staff interested, but also do a lot of good for the station, keeping the transmitters on the air, interesting control systems we've been able to customize and develop over the years, and love to share some of that with you. Love to talk about HD radio. I'm pretty passionate about HD radio, and we could get into that a little bit. And just generally what we do in Boston and how we keep everything on track.
Well, tell you what, since, Paul, you brought up HD radio, that's one of about 5 or 6 topics that we're going to hit on. And just to let the audience know, I met Paul back probably it was not long after I started working with Telos and Omnia, and Axia didn't exist at that point. It was Telos and Omnia, probably back in 2001 or 2002. And I was greeted at Greater Media in Boston by some of the most advanced technology that I'd ever seen in my life in a broadcast facility. Paul and his staff had taken at what was at the time the leading edge of technology and incorporated a lot of these things into the day-to-day broadcast operations. So they were grabbing, for example, song title and artist from a song ahead of what was playing, and I get putting that on RDS so that you would be made aware of what was coming up. But when they had a contest going on, hey, listen for the Madonna song at 7:15 this morning. They had to make sure to not preview that Madonna was the next artist to play. So they had to take care of things like that. And Paul had one of the earliest systems I'd ever seen for remote HTML access to the transmitter site. So you could see the status of alarms or the fuel tank or the tower lights or any number of things at the transmitter site. This was all just incredibly fascinating and cutting edge back in 2001 or 2002. So I appreciated Paul's, taking what was out there and taking the first fruits of people's technical labor and incorporating that in the broadcast. So Paul, you had mentioned HD radio and how you are a fan of this technology and a believer in what it can do for broadcasters, and I suppose the consumers too. So why don't you give us your thoughts on HD radio, and we'll expound on that from your comments.
Okay. There's been so much said about HD radio. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got involved with HD radio. And Greater Media was an early adopter back in, I think it was 2004. We were one of the first major markets to go ahead and put it on the air, and a lot of stations obviously followed suit. But I'll tell you a story about my first experience with HD radio on FM. All we have is FM stations in Boston, but I'm a big listener to the competition WBZ here. And the first time I ever heard WBZ in HD, it was so startling that I was convinced it wasn't WBZ, because you're used to hearing all these air talents in a limited bandwidth situation, but 3 kilohertz or so, or 5 kilohertz, whatever your receiver will do. And then all of a sudden, I'm sitting in the driveway of our transmitter site, and I've got this brand new HD radio on, and WBZ is on in HD, and you listen to it, and you just say, what programming am I listening to? It sounds like news, but the people, I don't recognize the people. And so that was very exciting.
Paul, I've shared a similar experience. The first time that I heard AM HD radio, and Tom Ray will back this up because he's doing AM HD there in New York on WOR. The first time I ever heard it was on a station in St. Louis, and I had an AM HD, FM HD radio in my Toyota 4Runner at the time, and I was listening to an AM station, and it flipped over to the HD version of it. And I think it was KFUO, which is owned by the Lutheran Church there in St. Louis. I'm driving around, I'm on the phone as I'm driving around, and I get done with the phone call, I put it down, and my brain then returns to the radio in the car, and my brain says, Kirk, I don't remember you switching over to FM. And then I realized, I'm not on FM. That's an HD AM. Now, granted, it was talk. It wasn't music, and it was lightly processed. So they really had it set up very nicely. But my brain said this was FM. So it was that clear. Let's bring Tom Ray in. Tom, what's your experience with HD on WOR and people's reaction to hearing it for the first time?
They usually sit there with their mouth open, especially if we hit a commercial set, or if we're running a bumper into or out of a commercial set, because the music is stereo, and we run a lot of spots for Broadway shows, and all those commercials are in stereo. And I recall, we had it. I forget how long we had it on the air. And I was asked by Ubiquity if I would take a couple of reporters around, one guy from Time and one guy from an automotive magazine, and I can't for the life of me think of the automotive magazine. But anyway, the guy from the automotive magazine wanted to be dropped back off at his office, and I'm pretty familiar with the coverage around town. And where his office was, I had to go down 40th Street, and I had to go down to 3rd Avenue, and then take a left and go north to circle around and get him where he had to be. And I had never been down 40th, down to the corner of 3rd. And I remember coming up to this intersection, and there were 4 big buildings on the corner of 40th and 3rd. Formed a big box, and I'm sitting there going, "Oh my God." Because I don't know what the signal's going to do, because the AM signals bounce like mad, FM signals too in New York City. And we pulled up to this light. It's just playing away. And one of the guys said, "Well, what's the analog sound like?" So I dumped it into the analog mode. You could barely hear the radio station. I mean, that's how noisy it was. And I kicked it back into digital, and it went and kicked right back in. It was like an FM station, and their jaws dropped. It was like,
yeah.
And so did mine.
And so many engineers, myself included, who remember AM radio from 20 and 30 and 40, 40 years ago, I remember AM radio, and say, well, hey, AM used to be really wide band. It used to sound better analog than it does today. And that's absolutely true. But 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, we didn't have all these noise-generating devices in our homes and our businesses. That just ruin AM analog reception.
Well, that's part of it, Kirk. The other part, too, is even before we had all these great gizmos to deal with. And, I'll be the first to tell you, I get in the car in the morning. The radio, I start the car, the radio comes on. I live in a weak signal area for WOR, so it's noisy anyway. I'll plug my cell phone in. That's the first nail in the coffin. Because all of a sudden it gets a lot noisier. Then I turn the GPS on and forget it.
Oh,
it just goes away. It just goes away. It's like, bang, hit it out of the park. Might as well just turn on a noise generator. But many years ago, we didn't have the stations crammed in the way we have them today. And that was, and Paul, you may want to comment on this. I'm going to say that was probably the early 80s, maybe the late 70s when the FCC started allowing all these stations to get crammed in. And, of course, once you start cramming all these stations in, you have to narrow the bandwidth of the stations so they don't interfere with each other. And then they came out with the NRSC regulations, and they narrowed our bandwidth to 10 kilohertz, and the rest is history. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and Tom, the other thing was, I think you'll agree, the receivers have been narrowed down too. In the old days, the receivers were much more broad and obviously allowed the stations to sound a lot better. Nowadays, these chips and these plastic receivers are very narrow banded, and by necessity, I guess. But by definition, that doesn't allow your station to sound as good as maybe it did in the 1960s.
And Paul, you're right. I've got in the living room, I've got a 1930s Cathedral Philco radio. That sounds really, really pretty. And in the living room, I've also got a surround sound system, and the AM sounds horrendous. And I finally looked at the specs one day. Why does it sound horrendous? The audio bandwidth is 2.5 kilohertz on the AM side. It's like, I might as well get a telephone. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, Paul, so we've been talking about AM HD, and it seems like there were a number of stations that started that or tried it a few years ago. A number of stations tried it and turned it back off. I can think of a station, a well-known station in Atlanta, where they put AM HD on the air, and it turns out the GM and the sales managers' cars had AM radios that were wide enough in bandwidth to where they picked up the HD subcarriers on the sides and sounded like a lot of noise on the AM. And the GM said, no, we're not having this on the air. Turn it off. Went on long.
Yeah, and a lot of stations also that are AM were doing sports. And, of course, there's an inherent delay built into the HD signal and the HD processing. And when you've got a lot of people in a stadium, maybe 80, 90,000 people in a stadium, and a good portion of those want to listen to the game, the stations ended up going out of delay and going out of HD. to accommodate all the people that were, interested in real-time radio again. And so that didn't help the cause for AM as well. Another observation I have, and I'd like to get Tom's take on this, is one really tough, I guess, I don't want to use the word flaw, but a tough thing to get around is the blending with AM HD. And when you go from areas of good coverage to bad coverage, obviously the bandwidth shifts, and that can be very distracting in any environment. So I wonder what your take is on that, Tom. It seems to me like that's a big hurdle for AM stations to get around that want to be serious about HD.
Well, I think you're right, Paul, and unfortunately, there's really no way around it, because you're going to have to blend. I mean, you can set the radio to go to digital only, but then you have the cliff effect. If you go under a bridge, boom, it goes away. But conversely, so does satellite radio half the time. So depends on what you're what you're trying to do with it. And you're right, it's an abrupt slap in the face. I mean, the AM section on the radio I have in the car sounds pretty good in analog, but when it blends over to the digital side, it's all of a sudden it just opens up, the stereo separation comes in, and you sit there and go, whoa. I'm used to it, but then again, I've lived with it for so long now. But even with the FM, I tend to find it a little bit annoying, I guess you'd say, because on the FM, when you blend into HD, and maybe I listen to it a little too close, the high frequencies tend to smooth out because you don't have the pre-emphasis curve. Yeah, and I hear that happen, and I sit there and go, what happened? Gee, it sounds better. Why? So yeah, the hybrid HD thing, I mean, it's good for what it is, but at some point, I guess we're going to have to make a decision as an industry whether we want to, stay hybrid, or whether we want to bite the bullet like television did and go all digital. I just don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, and then there's the cascading algorithms, which seems to be prominent on both AM and FM. I notice it a lot on BZ. But, a lot of the material comes in already bitrate reduced, and when you run it through the HD again, it, to someone who's tuned into that, and I am, you can really notice it. So it's too bad, because a lot of the commercials come in now that are, coming through the internet. They come in as MP3s or whatever, and when you run those through too many times, it starts to sound pretty grungy.
Oh, you're
Tom,
right,
you and
especially in MP3, and especially if you're on remote. We've gone to AAC on remotes because the AAC codec tends to play pretty well with the HD radio codec, but a layer 3 codec, especially with the bit reduction that you're using on ISDN, I call it the halo effect. There tends to be, it's almost like a halo is around the audio, and it just drives me nuts. That's why we went to AAC.
Yeah. No, we all got to be careful with that stuff now. Never really was an issue, but now with HD, it's becoming more and more of an issue. But I wanted to comment on HD radio in general and where we're going with it. A lot of people, a lot of broadcasters, especially managers and programmers, don't see the value of HD radio, and that bothers me a lot, because we're seeing every other entertainment industry. You've got digital television, you've got satellite radio, MP3 players. Wherever we get our entertainment now, almost everything is coming through digital. And it seems like if radio doesn't proceed in this direction, that we're going to be a dinosaur pretty quickly. And what happens is, a lot of people don't realize, and management types either don't, I think, is the potential for using digital radio is not just music and voice anymore, but we've got, in effect, a conduit to provide other services and other things that we can monetize through this bit stream that we're now able to broadcast. And that's not getting the right attention, in my view. I think we have to get over that hump, and it's the chicken and the egg thing with the receiver manufacturers and the broadcasters and the economy. All those things have kind of come together to be a perfect storm that's kind of in the way of progress here, and it's really unfortunate. But I feel pretty passionate about this issue, and I'm just hoping that that broadcasters get get by it sooner rather than later, because we've also got the issue with the power level thing, and that's something I never understood from the beginning. Being in FM, the very first time we turned this on, getting back to my story back in 2004, I was so excited to go in the car and look around and drive around and see, how this worked. And I knew almost instantly, probably within an hour of when I turned on my first HD station, that there was something wrong with the reception. And that was 2004. And I talked about that at the NAB, I think, in 2004, 2005. And now it's finally coming to fruition where people are realizing, hey, the power level, is not right, and it's not replicating the analog. And why should consumers have to put up with, a signal that's inferior as far as coverage goes? So, the FCC finally took action a year ago or so, and now we can raise the power. But not everybody can afford to do that. And what's happening is every single receiver that's sold is ending up possibly a public relations nightmare for broadcasters, because they get the radio and they're all excited and they've paid $100 or $50 for the radio, and they can't pick up their station, or it's cutting in and out, and these HD2 stations are supposed to be great. And we get a lot of phone calls, and I'm pretty serious about responding to every single one of them, explaining what the situation is. But it's frustrating because we've upgraded one of our 5 stations in Boston to minus 10 or minus 14 dBc, which is 10% of the actually, what is it? It's still a lot lower power level.
It's about 4%, Paul.
4%. Okay. But it's expensive, somewhere in the area of $200,000 for a major market station. So it's difficult to get the broadcasters to move forward with that, and I'm hoping that changes in the near future.
Paul, when you went up to minus 14, did you notice what we noticed in Hartford was that the HD coverage became much more solid, and we didn't have the constant shifting back and forth between analog and digital at the fringes. All of a sudden, we just held it right to the very end, and bang, the digital went away, and that was it.
Yeah. No, we noticed that. In fact, we did some testing with elevated sideband too on the asymmetrical sidebands that were approved by the FCC for testing. We got a STA last year for WKLB to do some of that, and we were able to work with Ubiquity and quantify some of the reception improvements that we saw. So it's definitely there. It's definitely doing some good. In my opinion, it isn't quite as good as the analog still. I think minus 10 almost replicates the analog. Minus 14 is much better than minus 20, but not quite what I'd like to see anyway.
Hey, guys, I wonder if we could quantify some of these numbers. We as engineers, if we're in HD radio, we know what minus 10 dBc means and minus 14 dBc and minus 20 dBc means. But let's kind of explain that for those who are listening who maybe don't have HD radio. What does that mean, minus 14 dBc?
That means the signal is 20 dB. The digital signal is 20 dB under the peak analog signal, which is carrier level in an FM station.
So if your carrier if your carrier is 100 kilowatts and you're minus 20 dBc, then you're only you're 1%, 1 kilowatt of digital transmission.
That's correct. That's 1%. Minus 14 equates to just about 4%, and minus 10 is 10%. And we probably don't want to go into the math here because it's a logarithmic function. That's why you go from minus 20 is 1%, and then 14 is actually about 4%, and then you say, gee, but now we're minus 10, so we're 10%. It's all a logarithm. You'd have to look up the dB formula.
So according to what Paul has said and what you've said, Tom, is that the original spec of minus 20 dBc or 1% of your analog carrier level could be your digital carrier levels. That just wasn't really working out so well for receivers. Of course, and that to the layman, well, that kind of makes sense. Well, wait a minute. you're a 100,000 watt station, but only 1,000 watt digital. How do you expect that to cover as well? And we're saying that minus 14 is a typical level that people can go to, and it's about 4% of your analog carrier. And minus 10 dBc is about 10%. So if you're a 100,000 watt station, and then you're able to pump up your digital carriers to minus 10 dBc, that would be about 10 kilowatts of digital carrier level. And your thinking and your experience has been such that really mimics your analog coverage area, right?
My opinion is it does. I mean, we've done some driving tests, and we've mapped that out, and it looks to me like that is the closest I've seen to mimicking it. It's very easy to quantify this kind of thing, and Ubiquity's been up here with their van, and we've run it at all different power levels. Well, 3 different power levels, mostly minus 10, minus 14, and minus 20. And we have a real good idea of where our analog starts to drop off. But I personally think that the closest thing to it is minus 10. Minus 14 just is much better, but just doesn't quite do it. And I think we owe that to our listeners. I mean, if we're going to take a leap in technology, we're going to offer better quality audio and more programming and all that kind of stuff, we owe them at least the coverage that they're used to having. And that would be my take on it.
Paul, in terms of your HD radio programming, how many FM stations does Greater Media have in your market in Boston?
Yeah, we have 5. We have 4 music stations and 1 talk station. And then our multicast programming, we have HD2s on all of our primary FM stations. And they're doing some interesting things with some of the formats there. For example, our country station has HD2 counterpart that is just oldies country. WMJX is a soft rock station, and we have a jazz counterpart on the HD2. Our talk station, WTKK, its counterpart plays Irish music. So there's an opportunity for some real different stuff to get on the air. And a lot of people around the country are doing some very creative programming, allowing younger people to get in and do some experimentation, within the limits of the license, of course. And it's great because we're able to offer different services. So you're seeing this happen all over the country. It's really good.
Hey, we got to pause for a moment here. You're listening to or watching This Week in Radio Tech. This is episode number 119. We've been doing this for over 2 years, and thank you very much for you, the listener or viewer, participating in our show, downloading the show or watching or listening live. We appreciate it very much. And I want to tell you that I appreciate very much our sponsor. Then the sponsor of this episode is Axia Audio. Hey, I brought along a little show and tell on this show. I'm doing the show for my part from the Telos Alliance headquarters in Cleveland, Ohio this week. And that's not my usual domicile. I'm usually in Nashville. Well, I took a little stroll through the warehouse in the back of our building, a huge warehouse, and it's really well organized now. And I brought with me here this device right here. This is a Core, that's spelled with a Q, QOR, a Core 32. This is an amazing device. First of all, it's fanless. It's got this heatsink in the front that looks kind of pretty. It's got some LED lights to tell you what's going on. And this is the business end right here. I get away from the mic here. This is the business end of the console. This is the engine that runs the IQ console from Axia. There's also a couple other surfaces you can plug into this. You can plug in an expansion surface that has 6 faders and a telco controller. You can plug in 6 faders and some user programmable buttons, or you can plug in an 8 fader expansion as well, plus the main 8 fader console that has the meters and all that. Well, on the back side of this, here we go. On the back side of this, you've got all these inputs and outputs. There are microphone inputs, 4 of them, which is enough for most studios, and they can be phantom powered individually or not. There are a bunch of analog stereo inputs, analog stereo outputs, AES inputs and outputs on the back of that, and a bunch of GPIO for contact closures going in and contact closures coming out to run things like CD players or tally lights, whatever you need. But here's what's also cool. There's an Ethernet switch that's built right into the back of this. It uses the same chipsets as, say, Cisco switches, a Marvell chipset to run these Ethernet ports. There are a couple of gigabit ports for connecting to other studios, and there are a couple of small form factor pluggable ports, SFP ports. So if you want to run a fiber optic cable directly into the back of this, you can. Just get an SFP adapter for fiber optic, and you got it right there. There's a couple of 10100 ports, and there are 4 ports here that also provide power over Ethernet, which means now you can plug in PoE extra devices here, like a VSET telephone from Telos, or the up-and-coming new X nodes from Axia. There's also plugs here to plug in the console portions, and there's even a port here to plug in a backup power supply. So you could have 2 power supplies, redundant power, for the Core 32. So that's the basis of the IQ console. And I would encourage you to check it out. If you go to the website, axiaaudio.com/IQ, you can read all about the IQ console, how expandable it is. And, price-wise, you can outfit this thing with like 3 times 8 is 24. 24 faders plus the engine here for just about $12,000 list price. Of course, discounting available through many dealers. So check it out on the web, axiaaudio.com/IQ, and get yourself a live wire infrastructure in your broadcast facility. Much easier to add more things to it later on. All right. You're watching This Week in Radio Tech, episode 119. I'm Kirk Harnack, along with Chris Tobin, who I haven't let him get a word in edgewise. We're going to have to do that. Hey, Chris, you still there?
I'm still here. That's okay. I'm leaving the HT to the experts.
Tom Ray is here with us also from WOR and Buckley Broadcasting, and our guest, Paul Shulins, who's the Director of Technical Operations at Greater Media in Boston. And I think we've got a good chance here to segue nicely into a related subject. We've been talking about HD radio. We started out with AM HD and then FM HDs and the multicast, or the additional HDs that you can put on FM to get extra programming. Maybe you've got some really niche programming, like in Boston, Irish music. Perfect thing to put on the air. But we got to measure the audience on all these services, and that's where we get into this technology that's known as PPM, stands for Personal People Meter. And this is something that the Arbitron company brought to the forefront of our minds here in the U.S. And Paul, you've got a lot of experience with PPM. I understand that you're a believer in the technology, working through maybe its couple of frailties and expanding on its strong points to measure audience and measure it accurately. Why don't you talk to us a bit about PPM and how you guys make sure that you're getting your money's worth and your audience worth out of this technology?
Yeah, PPM, came to be a while back. They did a lot of testing in Philadelphia and I think over in England, where they were looking for a way to broadcast a watermark on the air on AM and FM stations. And this watermark would be detectable by a portable device called a people meter that people would wear. And they'd gather rating information from this. And it really turned broadcast programmers' worlds upside down when they started to appear a few years ago, 5 or 6, maybe not even that, 3 or 4 years ago, throughout some of the major markets and medium-sized markets in this country. And the programmers just had to reinvent themselves because before, the traditional way of measuring audience with radio was with paper diaries, and Arbitron would enlist people to write down what stations they listened to. But this people meter, really was very robotic and unforgiving, and in a lot of ways that's good. But programmers thought that in a lot of ways it was bad too, because a lot of station formats suffered when the people meter came in because of the listening habits and the ways the stations were programmed. And I won't get into too much of the philosophical whether it's better or worse, but I'd like to talk a little bit from an engineering standpoint about what we did and how important the people meter encoding is for us. The fact of the matter is, well, let me start from the beginning. Arbitron actually provides us with these people meter encoders that go in line with the program material and insert this psychoacoustic inaudible watermark into our audio, and we broadcast that over the air. And this watermark is audible only supposedly to the PPM monitor.
This is an amazing technology that you can audibly transmit something that you and me and Tom Murray and Chris Tobin and supposedly no listener can actually hear. And yet a little device the size of a pager can hear it and identify its unique identifier. And so it knows what audio you're being exposed to. Have I got the tech about right there?
Yeah, and what's really amazing, Kirk?
Yeah,
we had an SBE meeting in New York. WR put it on the air before it officially came to New York City. We had this teeny tiny little radio sitting in the window with a lousy signal. It was noisy. The guy had this little thing sitting on his belt, and he was walking around the room. And we were having our meeting, and everybody's talking. He took it out, plugged it into his laptop computer, and came up with every code that was transmitted during that 45-minute time period. It was absolutely amazing.
So it's a robust signal. Sounds like it's more robust than, let's say, the same alerting tones that are part of EAS, which seem to be able to get corrupted on certain transmission paths.
Yeah, the Arbitron definitely put a lot of research into this, and you're right, it is very robust. If you're walking down a shopping mall and you're walking past a store that just happens to have a radio station on in the background, that PPM will pick it up from 20, 30 feet away. It's just, it's really amazing how well the watermarks work and how sensitive the electronics are. But it is so critical now for stations like ours and like Tom's, anybody in a market that is measured by Arbitron, to make sure that these watermarks are already there. And Arbitron takes it very seriously. They give us all the monitoring equipment and all the encoding equipment we need to make it happen. But I would say that the Arbitron encoding equipment is one of the most, if not the most important piece of equipment that we have to keep going. Because if you think about it, if that encoding isn't there, it's worse being on the air without the encoding because you don't realize what's going on. Without that encoding, you're completely invisible to the ratings. And that was a new concept for all of us to swallow, I think. So it became very important for us to make sure that that encoding was consistently there and at the levels it should be. So one of the things that we did, and every station did that takes it seriously, is we hooked up these Arbitron PPM monitors, which are single rack mount devices that can monitor off usually the tuner, the audio, and it gives you a signal, a contact closure that says everything's okay or everything's not okay. And you can imagine with it's not only just our 5 FM stations, but we've got the HD1 stations, the HD2 stations, and every single stream we put out, and we put out 10 more streams, you start adding these numbers up and you get into the 20s and 30s of PPM signals to monitor. So there's a lot going on there and a lot of stuff you have to make sure that is still there. So one of the things that we did was we put together a kind of a monitoring central area where we have a big 30-inch screen right where you walk into the engineering shop, and it's got these rectangles on it with some custom programming that we wrote that is all green when everything is good. And then if any one of these Arbitron monitors doesn't see what it's supposed to see, it not only pages us, but the screen has a red rectangle that comes on, and it lights in the studios, and all kinds of hell breaks loose when it's not right. So that's one of the things that we and many stations had to invent, was a good way of monitoring all the integrity of all this PPM stuff.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, we were doing the show live from the Cox Media Group in Tampa, Florida. And Dylan Scott, one of the engineers there, said, hey, if this PPM is not working, we're off the air. Doesn't matter if we're actually on the air, but financially, we're off the air.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think it's even more important that the PPM is being produced than actually being on the air, because you get a false sense of security. If you're on the air without the PPM encoding, you think everything's going along just fine. So we had to get used to that. That is really the law. And that's why we put so many enunciators all over the place. We even took it to the point where we put these streaming radios. You can buy these radios. They look like desktop sets, but instead of off air, you put an Ethernet cable in, and you can tune it to your streaming radio station. So we bought an array of these for all of our streams, and actually pumped those into the HD or the Arbitron monitors, so that we get contact closures and information when even our streams lose encoding.
So one of the people in the chat room, Navion, who's been our guest on the show, actually, is asking how robust is the PPM's watermark through other encoding? Like, let's say you're streaming audio, or even if you're on a fairly low bitrate HD channel, let's say you're doing an HD3 or even an HD4 channel that is at a pretty low bit rate. Does the PPM make it through that reliably?
Yeah, it does. It's pretty amazing technology, and Arbitron has done their homework, and it does do it. One thing I will say, though, and this is an observation that many talk stations have noticed, and I'd like to get Tom's take on it too. The way that the Arbitron encoding works, and of course they keep their secrets close to the vest, and understandably why, but it does need modulation in order to produce the watermark. In other words, during silent periods between syllables, breaths, whatever, there can be no encoding because of just the principle on the way the Arbitron encoder works. It needs modulation to work. So it seems that it would be logical that on stations that don't have continuous modulation, like talk stations, there isn't as much fodder or material for the encoder to work with, and therefore the danger, at least in some people's mind, of not as many codes being generated. And if that's the case, maybe not as many codes get received by these pagers, by these portable people meter things. And the big question is, of course, does that in any way affect ratings?
Tom?
Oh, well, we didn't see any change when we put the PPM on a WOR, but then again, we tend to be rather dense with our modulation, and our hosts tend to keep gabbing no matter what happens. Now, we did have a problem at one of our other stations that's also a talk format where they don't gab quite as much. Well, I take that back. They do talk quite a bit, but all of a sudden they started getting alarms on the PPM monitor. And I was up there one day. I was at the station, and I was observing the afternoon guy. And he would run his own board. And his mic levels and the spot levels were great. And then he'd get a caller on, and he'd bring the caller up, and the caller would be about this low. That's how the caller was. And then he'd start talking, and then he'd had low-level callers, and he'd let the caller go for 2 or 3 minutes. And all of a sudden, you start getting. Finally, had to put it's a device called a compeller. What it is an audio compressor. We finally had to put the compressor after the studio and before the main processing. Between the studio and the PPM device to bring the average level up of the caller, because he just wasn't potting it up. We had to, we had to bring that level up, and we had no other choice.
Yeah, a lot of the tricks that the programmers are playing now too is using music beds in the background so that it does keep the modulation up. So they do it in a way where it sounds good, but for example, during a newscast on our talk station, there might be a music bed or some sounder going on in the background to just give the PPM encoder more to work with. And that's one example of how the ratings measuring is actually influencing how the station's being programmed.
Paul,
I remember.
No, you go ahead, Chris. I'll ask my question after yours.
When I was working at CBS, we work with the Arbitron folks, and we had the same question regarding talk formats, and we have a lot of them, as you know, in Boston. And we had asked, what happens in normal talk program? How does the Arbitron algorithm decode and stuff? And of course, they don't tell you the details, but they had assured us that as long as it's a natural rhythm of conversation and talk, the algorithm they've got somehow knows that the code's going to be interrupted, so to speak, but it's not going to impact the ability to rate or measure the audience. As far as the levels, we did discover that the boxes do require some very consistent level into them before they go into alarm, which was an interesting design. But they said the algorithm they use to measure the audience is very sophisticated and has the ability to know, for average. I'm not talking about if you pause and then come back, unnaturally, it's going to help any. But it was interesting what they would say and what not say, and just sort of nod their head at and go, no, you're definitely getting marks. I'm not sure if everybody in the business is fully understanding how to apply and what to do, but it's been interesting watching and working with folks with the PPM.
It seems to me the only problem that a station would have in not getting ratings they deserve from PPM is if you had long periods. If you had 2 or 3 or 5 minutes when you had no or not enough modulation. If you were playing the greatest hits album of Marcel Marceau, all right, then you may not get credit for that, that 15 minutes of time.
I worked with a programmer who was very good at the PPM understandings and how to format his clock, each hourly clock, and make sure he got the maximum out of the PPM. And what he told me was he doesn't think the pausing, natural pausing, impacted what he did at all. And the format was a music format, but it had a lot of talk and phone bits and stuff. What he did agree was if you had very long pauses like you mentioned. And they actually, he was showing me some charts and graphs because they can get very granular with PPM. And he could point out places where the overnight jocks weren't paying attention and their talking was not where it should be. And it was amazing how detailed it was. But that was unnatural. So if you're doing a normal talk format, as Tom pointed out, if your caller audio is low, you're going to have problems. So you have to correct that. But if it's just a normal, natural, say, syndicated talk show, it usually has a relatively balanced audio level. You should be fine.
Seems to me that if your audio is that low for that long anyway, you might actually be losing listeners.
I think if you had a diary, you'd have the same problem.
So, hey, Vinny in the chat room, Paul, is asking, why do you need PPM on your internet stream? Don't you know exactly how many people you're feeding there anyway?
Well, we do, yes. But we'd also like to get credit for anybody that's on the internet stream. So Arbitron is looking at not only the over-the-air stuff, but they're looking at the internet stuff too. And, it doesn't take much for 1 or 2 listeners even to make a big difference in the ratings. So what we do is we end up taking all the ratings and adding them together. So if one station's stream is added to the station's terrestrial broadcast signal, that could make a big difference in the end where you're trying to advertise that your station has X amount of ratings up here as opposed to a tenth of a point less. So basically the programmers will take anything they can get, and in order to do that they need to get credit for the stream as well. So that's why we encode just about everything. I mean, there aren't too many HD radios out there, but we're certainly encoding all our HD stuff as well.
To stations in a market the size of Boston, let's imagine that because of some screw-up, you lost a tenth of a share or a tenth of a rating point because of a technical screw-up with PPM. What does that cost you guys in dollars?
Well, I'm not an expert in that field, but I used to have hear about the rule of thumb where a 1 rating point was about $1 million in revenue, so a tenth might be $100,000. It depends on market and how much revenue is available in the market. So the numbers are big and they're significant as well. And then there's the competition. So if you can say you're ranked number 2 instead of number 3, that could make a big difference when advertising agencies go to buy your station. You need to be, maybe they only buy 3 deep, and if you're number 4, you're not going to be in that buy. So you could lose out by only a tenth of a point, and that could make a big difference.
Hey, Paul, how many...
Take it all.
Hey, Paul, it's Chris. I'm curious, over time, have you, the station, say in Boston, for the streaming audience, have you noticed any regular patterns for listener or number of streams and people tuning in, tuning out, or during, say, bad weather or breaking news story events or sporting events? Do you guys find that the stream is a good adjunct to the main air signal, or do you treat it as a different, almost like a different business unit, if you will? It's just out there, and if it fails or succeeds, so be it.
Interesting question, and broadcasters have so many different feelings about streaming. We use a service called Ando Media, which allows us to substitute commercials on our stream. So when we say one of our stations is streaming, we're streaming our live material, but our commercials, when we go to commercial, we're substituting commercials that are produced and sold just for the stream. And those commercials are bringing in very, very small dollars. So it's not like we're really making much money off the streams. But in terms of listenership to the streams, we get all that metadata, of course. And I haven't really studied it, but I have looked at general trends, and it's all daytime. At 7 o'clock at night, our listenership really goes away. You get some people that are listening from around the world, but for the most part, the bulk of our listeners on all of our stations are listening during the daytime. Obviously, that stuff gets quantified, but I haven't really been involved in looking at those numbers too closely. But my sense is that there's a real danger in broadcasters taking their eye off the ball and putting a lot of effort into this where we're not getting a lot of return. And I think it's important for broadcasters, especially the programming people and the salespeople, to keep their eye on the ball, which is traditional broadcasting, HD radio broadcasting, and analog radio broadcasting, which is our bread and butter. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have a web presence, and a lot of we actually have a video department now, and we're doing a lot of interesting things, and we're selling our services, producing web videos and all that kind of stuff. But there is a tendency to get carried away with this and to divert a lot of resources. And when you think about where your money comes from, your bread and butter, you really need to keep your eye on that rather than getting off into these areas that are really auxiliary areas that don't bring in much.
I want to move the conversation to one more subject, Paul and Chris and Tom, that Paul wanted to bring up, and I think it's pretty interesting. We've never really talked about this before. We've just got 5 or 8 minutes left in the show here, but let me set this up. At so many broadcast stations, almost all of them, we have fewer engineers taking care of more systems. And ostensibly, and I think overall, those systems tend to be more reliable than they have been in the past. They're more complicated. They tend to be more complicated, but they also tend to be more reliable. I'm thinking about my own radio stations in Mississippi and American Samoa. We have systems there that I haven't touched for years. I set them up. They sit there and work. The hard drives get dustier and dustier. The fans on the CPUs get dustier and more clogged, but yet they keep on working. The audio processing, I don't go and tweak it every 2 or 3 weeks. Well, hey, I'm not there for one thing, but it doesn't drift around. Audio consoles don't have tubes in them anymore, so we don't have to be tweaking things. And transmitters, more and more of them are solid state, so there's not as much tweaking and tuning to do there. Things tend to be more reliable, but that also breeds among engineers maybe a sense of complacency, but also a real sense of forgetting, how did we set that up? We were totally involved in that project 2.5 years ago or 5 years ago, and we haven't thought about that thing since. And now it's failed, or it's failing. And now we got to go figure out, what did we do a few years ago? How was this set up? Oh my gosh, it's not even Windows XP. It's Windows 98 running on this thing. What was the password? You kind of get what I'm getting at here. That we have systems that are they're older than our immediate memory of dealing with them. So, Paul, you were telling me before the show when we were talking about what you're doing with your staff to make sure that they're prepped to deal with emergencies with gear that they haven't dealt with in a while. What would that be?
Yeah. No, thanks, Kirk. I think that's great, and that's one of the things I really wanted to bring up tonight is the idea of complacency. And I experienced it for myself just this past week. I was up at the transmitter, and some things happened, and I built the whole thing, and I've been involved with it for 20, 22 years, whatever. But you're right, things are more reliable nowadays, and you don't exercise those skills every day that you need to. And when you don't exercise the skills, it's just like in anything, they atrophy, and you've got to drill yourself to keep yourself sharp on that. So when things are working well, you don't necessarily think about it. For example, our talk station. We have auxiliary studios that we've built, and we need to be able to move our station into another room on a moment's notice if something happens in the main room, like someone spills soda in the console or there's a fire or whatever reason. And one of the things I make sure my staff does is we have drills on a regular basis to make sure, A, the equipment works for us to move from one room to the other, but B, more importantly, so that the people work and we remember what we need to do. Because if we're not, we get so distracted on different projects that we forget how to do our jobs in certain critical areas. It's just like if you're a pilot and you're flying, you have to go back for recurrency training. It's the same thing with broadcasting. You want to be sharp. You want to have that recurrency. You want to have that currency in your mind of what you need to do. I was up at the Prudential building just last week where our transmitters were, and we had a failure where a couple of circuit breakers tripped down below on one of the lower floors. And I was looking at all the telemetry from home and trying to figure out what was going on, and it all just didn't make sense to me. And when I finally got up there a half hour later, I saw all the lights were out in the transmitter room of one of the 4 stations up there, and it just shocked me, and I had to sit there for a minute and say, what scenario would cause all this to happen? And then I finally figured it out, and we were on our generator, and the lights were going up and down a little bit, when the generator is under a heavy load, and it took me a good 2 or 3 minutes to figure out, hey, we're on the generator, because I thought it was something else, and it just doesn't happen that often. So what I like to do is to try and think about those things and to keep everybody sharp on it. And that's something that can really get in your way if you don't practice. It's just like anything else. Practice keeps you current.
Tom, Ray, you get a lot of systems there at WOR, and I haven't been to your stations in Hartford, but at OR, you've got more stuff there than I think you could remember. How can you keep current or keep ready to deal with an emergency?
Oh, well, similar to what Paul says. I mean, we kind of run through some scenarios. We keep notes. Nothing's more frustrating. And I got a call the other morning on something that, I didn't have any notes on me, obviously, at 4 in the morning. But it's sit there, and the guy told me what was going on. I'm sitting there going, damn, I know what this is. And I hadn't seen it in a couple of years. And all of a sudden it came to me, and I said, do this, hit this keystroke, we're done, okay, fine, talk to you later. Click, back to sleep. So no, we run through certain things. We go through logs. We keep logs on repairs at the studio. I keep meticulous logs at the transmitter site. This being a new site, it's been on the air about 6 years now. I've got 6 years of logs right there. I can go through it. I mean, chances are I've already seen it happen at one point. So that's how you do it. You just try and keep current the best you can, because you can't keep track of everything.
We've got one more quick topic to hit. I'm sorry, Paul. You go ahead and make your point, then I want to ask you about IEEE.
Oh, okay, thanks. No, the other thing is cross-training, too. If you have a group, a stable of engineers, too, you want to make sure that they all are cross-trained. I mean, obviously, people have their favorite things to do, and we've got one guy that normally takes care of this and that and the other thing. But what happens is if that guy is sick or on vacation, you want to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of what's going on. They don't necessarily have to be experts in each part of the radio station's engineering department, but I try and continue to make an effort to make sure that we cross-pollinate.
So the last quick subject I want to hit on here is, as broadcast engineers, once in a while we run across this organization called IEEE. And I'm not even sure I know exactly what that stands for. Hey, here at Telos, where I work, I know we get all kinds of magazines and journals, and we have thick books in the conference room that say IEEE on them. Paul, you have an interest in IEEE. Tell us about that.
I do. I was first turned on to IEEE 3 or 4 years ago by the great Tom Silliman at ERI, and went to a few of their meetings and actually ended up growing into the organization. They have a society called the Broadcast Technology Society of IEEE. IEEE has many societies, and it's, as most of you know, a worldwide organization. But the Broadcast Technology Society is very interesting. It's heavily weighted into TV, and I'm trying to bring more radio into it. And I happen to be co-chairing again this year the Symposium, which takes place in Washington, D.C., with my friend David Lair from NAB. And it's a very worthwhile symposium to go to. There are some incredible consulting engineers there, and some people that are just fathers and grandfathers to our industry. So I'd like to kind of put a plug in for that. But I'm also working to shake things up a little bit, to put some radio interest in there, and to really bring more of a contemporary and a younger crowd in. But it's a worldwide, world-class symposium that goes for 3 days in the middle of October, and I guess get the URL, but IEEE BTS.org, I think it is. I'll get that and post that somewhere, Kirk, where your viewers can look at it. But
sure, just let me know, and I'll tweet it and put it on our Facebook page too.
Oh, okay, great. But thank you for giving me the opportunity.
It's bts.IEEE.org.
Thank you.
bts.IEEE.org. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. But no, it's very informative, and if you can't make it down to Washington, D.C., there's also the opportunity this year to participate in the virtual symposium, where it's going to be available online, either live or by archive. And that's something that we just started this past year, and hopefully it's going to bring more people in.
There's subject matters and areas of interest are pretty wide-ranging. I'm looking at the IEEE.org website, not the BTS, but just the regular www.IEEE.org. And, for example, in the fall of 2013, you have the IEEE Vehicular Technology Conference coming up in Las Vegas. And in this year, in Anaheim in October, November of this year, you've got the IEEE Nuclear Science Symposium and Medical Imaging Conference. So you got broadcasting, you got vehicular technology, you got nuclear science, medical imaging. IEEE obviously covers an enormous range of things where electronics are involved.
And if you're at the NAB in Las Vegas, they do have a presence there. At least the BTS does, and maybe some of the other societies as well. So if you happen to be out there, it's a great place to stop by their booth and learn a little bit more about the BTS.
Cool. All right. Well, guys, we're going to have to wrap it up and go here. Before we do, we're coming to the end of our contest. We just have a couple or three more weeks where we can do this. But we every week, most every week, we've given away a license for a software product called Omnia AXE. It's a Windows running. It's a service that runs in Windows, so it's reliable. It runs at the service level. It's multiband audio processing and stream encoding. You can encode in MP3 or AAC, HEAAC V2, any of these things. And we're giving away a license for this software on each show. And Paul, from you, I need a random number between 1 and, hang on here, I think a random number between 1 and 21 will do it for me this week. So, Paul, random number, please.
All right, let's go with 17.
17. All right, let me start at the top and count backwards here. 17, 16, 15. All right, how about, I think this is number 17. This person retweeted the show start announcement, and this is Mike Phillips. He is on Twitter at MC Phillips with 2 L's. Let's see. He's into podcasting, webcasting, broadcasting, and audio. It's all good. Mike Phillips from North Carolina, USA. Congratulations. You are the winner of an Omnia AXE license. And, Mike, you get in touch with me, and I'll get you the information. How about that? So thank you, Paul, for your help on the randomizing. Not a perfect random number generator, I'm sure, but Anyway, good enough for Mike Phillips and the show. Hey, thanks everybody for being with us. Let's go around and close it out. Our guest on the show has been Mr. Paul Shulins, the Director of Technology at Greater Media or Technical Operations, I should say, at Greater Media in Boston. Paul, thank you for spending an hour with us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Also with us has been Tom Ray from the Hudson Valley of New York and Buckley Broadcasting, including WOR. Tom, thanks for coming to us from your ham shack.
You bet, and we'll see you next week, I hope.
And also the best-dressed engineer in radio. It's Chris Tobin from Manhattan, New York. Chris, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Kirk, and thank you, Paul and Tom. It's been great.
All righty, and thank you to Axia Audio, our sponsor for this episode of This Week in Radio Tech. Also, back at the TWiT Network, thank you very much, Burke McQuinn, for switching the show for us. Appreciate you very much. That's it for this show. Next week, I'm sure we'll have another exciting one. I should be at the home 20, so we'll see you there. Is that a QTH? Is that the right word, Tom? Will I be at my home QTH?
Yes, QTH is the correct phrase.
Does H stand for home? No.
I have no idea what it stands for, but QTH means you're home. You're at your home base.
Well, all right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Appreciate the chat room, too. And thanks to Leo Laporte and the whole TWiT Network for putting us on the intertubes. We'll see you guys next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye, everybody.